Hello, Dr. Whelshula. I was wondering if you could start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely. My name's Martina Whelshula. My given name from my great grandfather is Skinwalks, which means dress touches the ground, and it is my great grandmother's name that I was given. So I was pretty fortunate to get an ancestral name. I am a
Hmm.
member of the San Aichks. We are the people of the speckled fish, or otherwise known as the Arrow Lakes Nation of the Colville Confederated Tribes in northeastern Washington State. I am a mother of six and a grandmother of 20. The youngest she's 14 months now, I think.
Wow.
And a lot of my background is I have um, about over 40 years of experience working in education, especially in Native American education. And I also have my master's degree in counseling psychology, and my PhD is in traditional knowledge, which is traditional knowledge is like indigenous worldview type of stuff. So I got to travel around the world and study in other indigenous communities about their traditional knowledge. So I was
Oh,
down
wow.
in Yucatan. I got to study with Mayan Daykeeper. I was in Hawaii studying with Hawaiian elders. We studied with the African Kumalamba on the Kumalamba
Mhm.
healers about their traditional knowledge, and just had experience with others like the Sami people of Northern Europe and their indigenous cultures there. So it was a fascinating doctoral program, and
Mhm.
it was the beginning of my decolonizing. It was really a powerful program. Um,
Mhm.
so a lot of the work that I do right now is currently I am working with Harvard Medical School's Division on Addiction, and
Mhm.
we're developing an emergency mental health response approach for tribal communities. And this is
Mhm.
where we train everybody from high school students on up to grandparents and aunties and
Oh,
uncles
wow.
and tribal leaders and around mental health, around
Mhm.
intergenerational trauma, like anxiety, panic disorders, depression, self-harm, so that everybody has that information, um,
Mhm.
and and then they're able to then identify it and know how they can help support maybe a cousin or somebody that's struggling. The other project that I'm working on is with the Empire Health Foundation, and we're developing an integrative cultural healing model. And
Mhm.
so this is where we actually go out onto the land, and the
Okay.
land, earth, and all of that becomes part of that therapeutic relationship. So a lot of it, because of boarding schools and things like that, a lot of tribal communities, we have a lot of disrupted attachment. And
Mhm.
so human relationships aren't very safe. So what
Mhm.
better than, because of our historical relationship with the earth and with the
Mhm.
natural world, then we go out and we help build those attachments with the earth, and then
Yeah.
simultaneously with the parents or with the therapist, or and
Mhm.
then also with the support of our elders. So they helped guide that whole model. So we just finished the training manuals for both, and so it's pretty exciting. A lot of the
Yeah.
stuff that's going on. Yeah. So
Yeah, that
so
all sounds like really amazing.
yeah.
So, my next question is, um, for those who don't know, can you explain what intergenerational trauma is? I know you mentioned it earlier.
Yeah. So there's we it's so some people might call it like historical trauma, intergenerational trauma. Um, we like to call it intergenerational colonial trauma, only because it's not just in our history, it's continuing today. We're
Mhm.
still continuing to be colonized, right? And
Mhm.
so it's still present, in our lives today, that we have to deal with a lot of stuff that comes from the state, from education, to mental health, to healthcare,
Mhm.
all of those things. But what it is it's really based on a history of colonial trauma. And it goes back, way back, of course, um, when, we look at genocide, where we have, the United States government, wanted to basically wipe out the tribes because it was preventing them from being able to develop in the way, move in on certain
Hmm.
lands, territories, and, those types of things. So we have the genocide aspect of that. And that was really, in fact, even our education as children, we were under the Department of War. And so
Hmm.
tribes were under the Department of War for so, decades, right? Nearly a
Hmm.
century. Um, and just kind of looking at the boarding schools where the government had, it was a government policy, basically to force children from their homes as little as 3 and 4 years old, force them out of their homes and put them into residential boarding schools. Now,
Hmm.
these boarding schools were typically run by religious denominations. So it might be Baptist, or like in our case, a lot of it was Catholic.
Hmm.
Um, you had other government-run boarding schools also, and so this is where there was a huge tear in the fabric of our tribes. When you take children away, but the whole idea was that that's how they're going to assimilate, right? Get the
Yeah.
children, assimilate them. They'll be easier to deal with, in the long run. Um, we have the land theft, where a lot of it was just stolen. At first they were, trying to treaty with the tribes, but then um, they decided there was just too much trouble, and so they made
Yeah.
the tribes as wards of the government, and then they just took it away from them. Some
Hmm.
tribes did treaty, but others did not, and so then they were
Yeah.
then ordered by executive order. And then just a lot of like, there was a lot of sexual trafficking of Indian girls and women that happened a lot, within our, our territories and stuff, by um, minors, by, even religious people, like missionaries that would come in, the government, just different people, gold miners, coming into the territory. Um, and then the prohibiting of us being able to practice our own spirituality and our own religions. And so
Hmm.
all of this, just kind of, just all of it is this cumulative trauma that we have, right? Not just as individuals, but as tribal communities, as families.
Hmm.
Um, and then the diseases,
Hmm.
smallpox, the biggest inroads. I used to think that it was like one wave of smallpox, when in reality it was several waves over decade or over the centuries, that
Hmm.
would come in and would wipe out almost nearly 90% of the population would
Oh,
have
wow.
died as a result of smallpox. And of course, we didn't have any immunities for measles. Um, uh, Flu, influenza was another one that caused a lot of deaths. Um, so this is just horrendous, kind of heinous trauma, right? That
Yes.
generation after generation is experiencing. So what happens is there's two different ways that we look at this. One is the epigenetic trauma, and then the
Hmm.
other, the actual experienced trauma that's passed on to each generation. So, for
Hmm.
instance, my mother and my maternal grandmother and grandfather, and then my maternal great grandparents all went to boarding school. So they're all
Hmm.
taken from their homes and were put into boarding schools. And boarding schools, do you know much about the boarding schools by any chance?
Not too much. I know that in my our history classes we've covered, like you mentioned, like the religious like assimilation and how like there was a lot of conversions that like they tried to force like on indigenous people. So I don't know too much, but I do know a little bit.
Mm-hmm. So this is where there was a lot of abuse that happened to the children, and my daughter and I, we do a training on epigenetic and intergenerational trauma, and we actually have like the actual accounts, the personal stories of elders who had gone through the boarding schools and all of the different things that would happen to them. I mean,
Hmm.
very brutal kinds of abuse and violence, and
Hmm.
also just malnourished. The nutrition labels, minimum daily requirements.
Yeah.
Those were actually done on boarding school children. And
Oh,
so,
okay. Yeah.
yeah, to see how long, to see the impacts of just, a malnourishment, type of a thing.
Oh my
Um,
God. Yeah.
you can find that in the Library of Congress. I was just like, oh my gosh, and so we have these kinds of things, right? So we have all of the abuse and the trauma that comes through. We have the malnourishment, we have all of this disrupted attachment, being taken away from
Yeah.
the families. And then what the boarding schools would do is they would put child on child as far as like punishing each other. So they set these
Oh
little
my
things
God.
that they called the gauntlet. And if the
Mhm.
child was got like demerits or didn't, got in trouble for something during the week, then at the end of the week, then they would have to run what they called the gauntlet. Well, the gauntlet was students, children on each side of the hallway, right? And then
Mhm.
then the child that was, being punished had to run through the gauntlet, and those children were forced to hit that
Oh,
child with belts,
yeah.
and
That's
whatever
awesome.
else they had. So that child is getting hit, but they're getting hit by other children. Or
Yeah.
children to hold down a child on the bed. One would have each of the, they'd have their ankles and the hands, while another child would beat that child. And if they didn't, then they would be the ones that would end up on the bed getting beaten. So do you see what I
Oh,
mean? So it's just this kind of
yeah.
force where children are having to brutally beat each other, in
Yeah.
that. You could just imagine the kind of the psychology that kind of creates,
Mhm.
intergenerationally. And then
Yeah.
the other one is just forbidding the children to speak their languages, right? My
Mhm.
father had to kneel on rice for extended periods of time when he would speak, the language. A lot of the elders that I've worked with, they just have so much trauma around that they don't even want to teach their own children our tribal languages because they don't want their children to be hurt. So
Mhm.
there's all of this that comes through. So we've lost a lot of our language because we were forbidden to speak it. And if they did speak it, then they were punished. And
Mhm.
so all of these kinds of things that happened in the boarding school. So that when my great grandparents and when my grandmother and my mother went through all of that, what happens with the epigenetics is that the trauma, the specific types of trauma, it sends like markers, right? Genetic markers. What these markers do is they attach to the gene and
Mhm.
they determine how that gene is expressed. So say
Okay.
for instance, we have like a serotonergic gene, which is a happy chemical, in our brain. But as a result of, say, some trauma, then there's a marker that attaches to that particular gene, and what it does is it methylates it, means it turns it down, so that child or person can't feel that the normal level of happiness. You know,
Yeah.
those are the kinds of things that get passed on through the generations. So
Oh
for
wow.
me, as a result of the trauma that my great grandparents, my grandparents, and my mom experienced, I was already born with that,
Mhm.
already a part of my DNA. And
Yeah.
so happens is that it I'm prone to PTSD.
Mhm.
It's asking me, no. Would you like to activate Zoom audio device? I don't think so. These things are popping up. So I'm prone already to PTSD. So
Mhm.
depending on my mom's um, experience during pregnancy, did she have a calm, nurturing, healthy, psychologically, physically healthy pregnancy? That's going to then impact me,
Mhm.
in right. But
Yes.
also, I already have that particular kind of wiring from my
Yeah.
great grandparents and my grandma. And so that first year of life is the most critical, so
Mhm.
in utero. And then because what's so cool about understanding epigenetics is that you can reverse those markers, those changes.
Oh,
But
okay.
it requires one is what they recommend is extreme bonding, right? So you
Mhm.
just love these babies up, you just love them up and you just do everything that you can in this kind of extreme bonding, and then that can really help kind of change those genetic markers, and
Mhm.
they can actually flip. But it
Okay.
also changes the wiring in the brain. And
Mhm.
so the epigenetic piece is, so I was prone to PTSD depending
Mhm.
on my early childhood. If I
Okay.
had a very loving, nurturing, healthy environment to grow up in, then that would change, right? I wouldn't have um, um, actually, experienced full-on PTSD.
Okay.
But in my case, I was parented out of a boarding school model,
Oh, yeah.
which was very
Mhm.
abusive. And so that kicked in it just triggered it, right? It just
Yeah.
immediately. And so then with me, I ended up with like what they call complex PTSD. And I think
Mhm.
that really when we look at intergenerational trauma, it is a collective um, complex PTSD. It's
Mhm.
what trauma that happens over and over and over and over again. So it happens
Yes.
with generations. And so the other piece of that is that so epigenetic is how it works in our DNA, right? The other
Mhm.
part of that is that psychological transmission of intergenerational trauma, and that my mother, as a result of her experience, she had PTSD, right?
Mhm.
She had a very severe anxiety disorder, and she just so that became the environment that I was raised in, the emotional
Yes.
and psychological environment. So that I picked up that whole piece too, so
Yes.
and not even realizing it, right? Because it's kind of like a fish in water, in a bowl. You don't
Yes.
realize that that's what's going on. But I'm learning because children are like little emotional sensors, right? They're like little sponges, and
Yeah.
they can pick up the nuances of that. So I'm not even realizing that I'm picking up the nuances of how my mother responds to stress,
Mhm.
or any kind of experiences, how she responds just habitually and automatically. That's what begins to get wired in my brain,
Mhm.
and so it's like we're looking at the epigenetic, which is the DNA, and the intergenerational, what I say, complex PTSD is that
Mhm.
psychological environment that I'm raised in. And so that's where that gets passed on through the generations. And it wasn't until I had this huge, oh gosh, it was a huge meltdown with my teenage daughters, right?
Mhm.
And it was just this huge blow up in our family. But I always say that that was the birth of my awareness in that
Mhm.
moment that they were going through. And I I really, it was one of the most emotionally painful times of my life,
Mhm.
with my teenage daughters and being confronted with my parenting. And
Mhm.
so that just like that just brought it all to, plus I was going through in my master's program in counseling psychology, so I was able to kind of look at it differently and try to
Yeah.
understand, what's going on. And I realized that what was happening is that it's like these narcissistic kind of foundations that my whole upbringing was just crumbling underneath me. My mom was a narcissistic mother, and I was taking on, being like her, and
Yeah.
I was able through that whole experience to flip everything around, and I realized the impact that my history in my
Mhm.
family, our history of colonization had on my ability to parent, my own health, but also that I was abusing my children.
Mhm.
And that was the most, it still makes me like want to cry when I think about it.
Mhm.
Um, because you try to be the best parent you can, right? But your
Yeah.
program is messed up, and you
Yeah.
don't even realize, think I'm doing the way I'm supposed to be doing, what they tell me how to do it, all that those kind, and not realizing that, this is so wrong, that something has to
Yeah.
change. And so it's really about then how do we change that, right? How do we break that cycle of trauma,
Yes.
you know, in our family. And so
Yes.
so then my children started to have children, and
Mhm.
I started to see myself in them. And I'm like,
Yes.
Oh no. Okay. And I know that my children love their babies, and so
Hmm.
I said, how about if we have a family meeting?
Yeah.
So I brought them in and I brought my mom in and I had my mom talk about her experience growing up and
Hmm.
how she was parented, from the boarding schools. And then I talked about then how I was parented by her,
Hmm.
then talking about then how I was parenting and what I
Hmm.
found out, in that, so that they could see it in themselves and they could see where it pops up, and how they might be able to kind of, you know, um, stop that cycle and let's make conscious choices. Let's
Yeah.
choose not to do these anymore. So now it's a question of, okay, now we know we're not going to do this, right? So we're not spanking our children anymore. We're not going to be yelling at them anymore. But then how do we do it? You
Hmm.
know,
Yes.
and that's where we found that through our culture, our tribal cultures teach us how to do
Hmm.
that. Our tribal culture gives us this roadmap, of how to
Hmm.
be in the world, but also how to parent, how we parent our children. Because I think that like one of the core values that we have is the sacredness of children.
Hmm.
And that was not how they were treated in boarding schools. In fact, they were demonized and they
Hmm.
were considered savage and dirty and
Hmm.
filthy. They would call them filthy, and there were just so many horrible things that would happen to them. And
Yeah.
which is so, it just such contrast to our tribal views and how, what our values are and how we treat children. So that's a
Hmm.
lot of the work that I do now is about how we bring in that tribal knowledge and then how we can help parents and other
Hmm.
adults within the community to be able to recognize and let's start making some changes in the way that we educate our children, the way that we discipline our children, the way we treat them,
Hmm.
and so a lot of that is about bringing back those old ways of, how our elders, would teach us, how to do that. So
Hmm.
intergenerational colonial trauma is it happened like that, you know what I mean? The violence and stuff, and it happened, over, century, right? And
Yes.
and it still continues today that we still have to deal with that. But the healing of it takes 3 times longer. So
Yes.
we can only imagine, like with, so if we look at the epigenetics, then when my grandmother was experiencing her abuse, then my mother was already programmed. I was already programmed, right? And
Hmm.
then now it's about me and my great grandchildren.
Yes.
Think about how sad it is that I may not see the healing of my family and my generation.
Hmm.
But it's something that we continue to just really work hard at in our family. Just always just, you know, making it more informed, making sure that we understand, what the most the healthiest and most healing strategies are within our families. But then so as we're doing this for our family, then we're like, anybody else that wants to jump on and learn too, um,
Yeah.
we will share everything that we know and experience type of a thing. So it's
Yes.
intergenerational trauma is hard. It's really, really hard. And I think that in the United States, you will see the two racial groups that really suffered a lot of that and still continues to suffer with that intergenerational trauma is African Americans and Native Americans within because of the genocide and the colonization and all of that had happened between with those two groups. So you can see a
Yes.
lot of that trauma in the communities for sure.
Yes, definitely. And I know you already touched on this a bit in your own personal experiences, but is there anything else you'd like to add on to the question of how does intergenerational trauma impact Indigenous communities and their mental health?
So this is why it is so difficult to really like, know how to go in and how to tackle all of this, right?
Hmm.
Because it shows up. So if we have PTSD, right? So you have a lot of, anxiety, you have a lot of panic, right?
Mhm.
Just the trauma in and of itself, it's like this persistent state of fear, right?
Mhm.
So then children respond out of this persistent fear. And
Mhm.
so where something there's a great photo or a great picture that shows that demonstrates that. And I can't remember the name of the author who did it, but he has a picture of a snake in a coil, right?
Mhm.
Like a rattlesnake. And then
Okay.
next to it, he has a picture of a garden hose rolled up like the snake.
Yeah.
And what he says is that with children with fear, this kind of, persistent fear, that comes from trauma, they'll see that garden hose rolled up and they will see a snake and
Okay.
they will believe it. It is a snake, although
Mhm.
it's not. It's safe, right? But children with
Yes.
trauma and persistent fear, they can't tell the difference and they will react as though it is real. And that's where they're this kind of hypervigilance, right? They're just hyper aroused all the time. So that's how
Yeah.
I was like one of those children that wherever I went, I scanned the room and
Mhm.
it was just automatic. It wasn't even anything that I did consciously, but I just recognized later that that's what I would do. I would scan the room emotionally, right, to see
Yes.
if it was a safe place. And
Mhm.
so children are always scanning, and they're not even doing it, in their awareness. It's all
Yeah.
out of their awareness, type of a thing. So you have a lot of that going on where they're just kind of this kind of hyper vigilance, and that takes a toll on the body and the brain because a lot of times
Yes.
it can kill brain cells depending on the severity of it, right?
Mhm.
Look at anxiety, depression, a lot of depression within our tribal communities. We have um, alcoholism
Mhm.
and addiction. And so alcohol was actually used by the government um, where they would, and also, like fur trappers and gold miners and just settlers in general, if they
Mhm.
wanted to like get something from the tribes, then they would bring whiskey, and
Mhm.
hard liquor into. So then it created this kind of this alcoholism through the whole community.
Mhm.
And then they could come in and they would give them alcohol if they could get some land, you
Mhm.
know, or they would get them inebriated so that they could make deals, right,
Mhm.
on kinds of things. So it was actually brought into the communities, and then the tribes, of course, not having that kind of stuff in their lives, and
Mhm.
imagine trauma, all of the stuff that they're going through, right? Alcohol had to be this relief for them, from all the
Yeah.
pain and all the fear and all the stuff that's going on. And so alcoholism then has been with us for centuries, and
Mhm.
it's something that we struggle with today. And then of course then the introduction of drugs, that are coming into our community. So we have um, alcoholism, drug abuse, and then we see a lot of child abuse, violence, childhood
Mhm.
abuse, violence, a lot of domestic violence. And if you
Mhm.
imagine a history of genocide, right, where
Mhm.
people are being murdered, they're being hung, they're being shot, they're just tried, the military goes in, it's a massacre, right?
Mhm.
So imagine just all of this violence and how that gets passed on through the generations. I was
Mhm.
doing my research in my doctoral program. I was doing it was actually about a critique of historical records at the time of first contact with my people.
Mhm.
Wanted like the voices, right? The voices of our people. And so when they said records, I'm like, okay, this is going to be interesting because we had oral tradition. We didn't have writing,
Mhm.
right? So
Yeah.
I found military transcriptions, and different things like that. And that's where then I was able to um, kind of see, what was going on back then through those writings and
Mhm.
recognizing just the level of all of the just very like, I, I can't even imagine the heart of a person who could do the things that they did,
Mhm.
to people. Um,
Mhm.
so then you have self-harm. We have a lot of
Mhm.
self-harm in our communities, and a lot of that has to do with, with, of course, PTSD, toxic shame that we have as a result of that PTSD and that trauma, and just the sense of just being a burden, right?
Mhm.
On family, on the community, those types of things. And of
Mhm.
course, we have high rates of suicide that we're experiencing too. And on top of this, okay, all of this, right, that's coming through our history, through our community and our tribe and our families and individual families and children, then we have the education system. And then
Mhm.
we have we have modern day educational trauma
Mhm.
because these children, little ones even, right, had
Mhm.
kindergarten, first grade, elementary on through, that they have PTSD, and then
Mhm.
they have these trauma responses, right? And a lot of time trauma
Yes.
response can look like anger. It can look
Mhm.
oppositional, where you're fighting against the person that's trying to help you, and you're angry, you hit, you might kick something. And because children, their brains get hijacked and they don't even
Yeah.
know what's going on and why they're responding the way that they're doing. So it's looking at how just that, recognizing all of the different ways that it kind of manifests itself in our lives. But in school, the child would get punished for it. So they're
Yeah.
already feeling anxiety, right? What
Mhm.
they need in that moment is they need someone to assure them that they're okay. You're safe.
Yes.
I'll be here. I'll hang in there with you, and you can teach children how to manage their anxiety. But
Mhm.
what the school does is that they punish, they suspend, they expel, they shame, all
Mhm.
that. And they get angry at children, right? Because they just want to teach, type of a thing. And so, but they add on, so that then they add on to that trauma. So then it becomes cumulative. So then
Yes.
those children then are experiencing that throughout their day in school.
Yes.
Got all these things that are going on in their lives, and we wonder why. And you look at the data, that
Mhm.
American children, have the worst educational outcomes, meaning the highest expulsion and suspension rates, lowest, completion rates of high school and graduation. It's just they're the lowest in, like, a lot of the academics, type of
Mhm.
a thing, and they're the highest in discipline, type.
Mhm.
So you can just see how it shows up in the schools and how they're even re-traumatized, through the school
Yes.
system. And that's something that I'm still working on. I've been working on that for over 20 years now, and I just
Mhm.
can't to move state leaders and saying, "Come on, you guys, we need something needs to change, and it needs to change within the system."
Yes.
And there needs
Definitely.
to be accountability. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And then I think that was it. I was trying to think of others. Attachment rupture shows up in our families. So we have a lot of our families whose children are taken away and are put
Mhm.
into foster care, or CPS involved, those types of things, and where you have parents who just don't know how to parent, and it's
Mhm.
their own, parenting. And I always tell
Yes.
people that parents are not active victimizers of their children. They're parenting out of the way that they were parented. And if we look at that
Yes.
history, of that intergenerational trauma and that violence, but then also the attachment disruption, where families can't even feel safe together, emotionally, psychologically in their homes. So we have just
Mhm.
a lot of that going on.
Yes.
There's so much. I mean, it's like, I'm just like, oh my gosh, it's just so. My daughter and I, we do a lot of training on intergenerational trauma, and
Mhm.
I find that I have to get numb about it sometimes in order to share the stories, but it's so important to share them, that people
Yes.
understand the full depth and severity of the violence, and just the loss and the
Yes.
unresolved grief. Can you imagine that it was happening between the government and the genocide piece, boarding schools, and the diseases? It was just like it was like a barrage, right? There's no time in there
Yes.
to have this normal, healthy kind of grieving, process.
Yes.
It's unresolved grief, and so we just
Yes.
carry it. And so then you have a whole, generations of people who are like have dissociative disorders, right? Where it's like we have these out of body experiences because we can't handle the pain of being in our bodies in under
Yes.
circumstances. And so I always like to say, I know it's not good to say this, but dissociation has been one of my best friends in a lot of
Mhm.
really painful experiences in my life, but
Mhm.
it's not good because you're dissociating from yourself,
Mhm.
so how do we have an in the body experience, right? How do we come back into our bodies? And
Mhm.
it's like calling your spirit back,
Mhm.
because growing up on the reservation and your family and your cousins and
Mhm.
whole community, it's like it's so tragic. And it's like
Yes.
you feel like it's so overwhelming. It's like, where do we even begin? It's like, and so what I do when I talk about, in trainings, I say we need to do not just one approach here or one, fix here or there. We need to do this kind of full court press, right?
Mhm.
Everybody in all of their roles need to be working towards the same goal, and everybody brings their piece to it, but then it has to be that full court press. It can't just be a program over here and program over there. It just needs to be this really intense kind of collective effort by the whole community, to
Mhm.
do what we need, do our parts, right?
Yes.
Be able to bring that healing about.
Yes. Um, so my next question is, how do Indigenous mental health care needs differ from other communities?
Well, I think that one is the collective trauma, right? That collective
Mhm.
historical trauma, because you don't find that very often, in other communities, unless they're collective cultures, right?
Mhm.
Smaller families, and cultures that are more collective. So I think there's a different way of looking at that, but a lot of Western systems, they don't understand it, and so
Yeah.
they want to address it in this more kind of individualistic way. Let's just deal with this person, right? When in reality, this person is part of a larger collective. So there's a real difference in that whole piece. Um, our worldviews are so different, and so I think this is one of the biggest barriers is that there's a lack of understanding, a lack of awareness about tribal worldviews, indigenous worldviews, and how indigenous worldviews are almost opposite that of Western European.
Mhm.
And that's what makes it so difficult. And so a lot of times what will happen is that um, these systems are we kind of borrow from a larger mainstream culture, right? Things that
Mhm.
might for mainstream America, but they're not effective for tribal people because our
Yeah.
values are different. And
Yeah.
it's what's interesting and what a lot of people don't understand is that our worldview is not just surface culture, not just that I like to wear beaded earrings, or that
Mhm.
I'm a jingle dancer or that I drum, those are kind of surface culture kinds of things.
Yeah.
Tribal worldviews it's all a part of a psychocultural worldview. So it's how we're wired psychologically. So
Yeah.
for us, or say in a conventional therapeutic situation, you'd be dealing with the individual and their nuclear family, type of a
Yeah.
thing. But with us, like it would be dealing with the whole, kind of the whole culture and who we are as a people,
Yeah.
because we're like, how is it? One of the elders said we're a we consciousness.
Yeah.
So what our values are going to be different, right, than an individualism.
Mhm.
Individualism is all about me, and
Yeah.
what's best for me and how I can get ahead and how I can do this, and so then they just focus on the person, which then for us that would be decontextualized because it's
Yeah.
me in the context of a whole community and a whole tribe in that worldview. And so just kind of looking at how we are different, just in. So here's an example, Nira. Um,
Hmm.
in our culture, we don't have a word for please,
Okay.
and please is actually it's actually comes from it establishes like status
Oh,
because
okay.
in European cultures, there are only certain people that would say please. And it was
Oh, okay.
typically servants, house, keepers, those kinds of things. Lower status people would ask please, to higher status, right?
Hmm.
So we don't have a word for please in our culture. And the reason why is that there wouldn't be a need for that.
Hmm.
I was visiting an elder. She was helping me. My grandmother had passed, and so I went to another elder in my community to help me give my children their Indian names. And so we were
Hmm.
visiting, and she was talking about how disappointed she was with one of her children, and because her child was trying to make her grandchild say please, and
Oh.
I was just like, I'm like, I don't understand. I said, I isn't that just kind of manners or being polite,
Hmm.
something like that? She goes, no. She said, we don't have please in our language because if a
Hmm.
child needs something, you give them what they need.
Hmm.
You don't make them beg for it.
Okay, yeah.
When a child has to say please for something, you're making them beg. And then I
Yeah.
thought about that as a child because it was like how adults would use that sadistically on children, right? It's like you
Yeah.
ask something and they go, what did you say? And I'd say,
Yeah.
please. And they go, I can't hear you. I go,
Yeah.
please, pretty please. And if you ever see that little, it's pretty please with the cherry on top, or
Yeah.
pretty please with the sugar on top. So we would beg to the point where we'd have to say pretty please with the cherry on top, kind of a thing,
Hmm.
and so it's just you think of it. So think about just the difference psychologically, how that is in a family, in a child's life, type of a thing, the differences, or that we don't have in our old language, we didn't have a word for spank.
Hmm.
So, when that was so like when surveyors of land surveyors would the first white people that would come into Indian territories, I remember reading a journal of one of them, and he was just really surprised at the way that the men treated their women, the tribal men,
Hmm.
and how they treated their women. And he said they were soft spoken. He called them meek, you know, um,
Hmm.
the way that they treated their children and their wives were just like, so he was saying that they weren't the man of the house, and they weren't, the authoritarian and, those kinds of things, but they were just very gentle, and they were, respectful, those types of
Yeah.
things. And so, looking at how with, spanking came from the boarding schools. And
Hmm.
so our word for spank is spitsansen, which means like it describes rope, so that they would, use rope for that.
Hmm.
But that's a practice that comes from the boarding schools because
Hmm.
children are sacred, right? You would never want
Yes.
to or make them
Yeah.
beg, those types of things. So we just kind of looking at, the differences of just that cultural worldview and also our spirituality. You
Hmm.
know, we don't have in our and I'm just going to speak for my culture, because
Hmm.
I'm not because tribes are just as different as amongst ourselves. I
Yes.
mean, some common we have common principles, and those types of things within our cultures, but there's still a lot of differences. But when we look at um, uh, just within our worldview and our spirituality, we don't have like our word for God,
Hmm.
or creator is Kwalanchutin, which means makes itself.
Okay.
That which creates itself or gives form to itself, type of a thing.
Hmm.
And we have no genders. We have no gender pronouns. So you won't see that it's not a male, it's not a man,
Hmm.
not a woman, right?
Hmm.
No gender to that. But then the idea of Gwen Chutin is it's not like an individual or a person. It's all of creation, right? It's not
Mhm.
like he was up there kind of guiding things. It's more that it's all about all of creation, everything, type of a thing. And there's this just this like this consciousness, I guess, that you is the
Yeah.
best way. It's hard to describe it. Can you imagine like like your conventional therapist, working with tribal people and not having that awareness at all, and how they project their own worldview into that therapeutic session,
Yeah.
therapeutic goals, treatment goals, those types of things. And even we have different understandings about wellness,
Mhm.
um, and healing. And so just kind of looking at, and a lot of that again has to do with our, uh, how can I say this? Our relationship with all of creation, right?
Mhm.
Is a sense of balance,
Mhm.
and that we're able to be in good relationship with all of creation, so
Mhm.
it's not just this concept of wellness is not just this kind of mental health, right?
Mhm.
It's about all of our relationship with everything, and
Mhm.
how we're, driven by our core values of, the sacredness of relationships, right? The value of our lands, our in all of the animals and all of everything, type
Mhm.
of a the value of our tribes, and we have, and the value of humor. And I think
Mhm.
about it, not that kind of passive aggressive, sadistic kind of humor. It's the kind of
Mhm.
the healing humor. And I think about how our cultures were just so brilliant when we
Mhm.
look at best practices today and how important humor is in healing, what it
Yes.
does to the brain and the neurobiology of humor, those types of
Yes.
things. And so that's, was always listed as, as one of our core values is humor. But the other thing I think that, and what you're, kind of talking about, um, that how it differs is that the systems, right? The systems that are created, they just don't understand the differences. So it's
Mhm.
not even individuals, it's like a whole culture, it's a whole system that
Yes.
doesn't understand those differences. And so then in that way, it's like, um, how can I say it? So conventional psychotherapy falls short of being
Mhm.
able to support the needs of tribal people. But I think that there needs to be a genuine, authentic interest, right?
Yes.
In that, and so we don't seem to find that very often, unless they
Yeah.
want to, unless you get cultural appropriation, then you have people that want to use it, in inappropriate ways, rather than
Yeah.
educate myself about, the people that I'm serving, and
Yes.
like what can I learn? And so a lot of like the integrative cultural healing model um, that a colleague of mine have developed, it's really about teaching clinicians, both
Mhm.
tribal and non-native. And then,
Mhm.
so this is, let's give it all to you, right? So that
Yeah.
you understand, what's going on, why things are done the way that they're done, all of those types of things. So it's really about training non-native clinicians in the appropriate ways to work with tribal community members. So yeah,
Yeah.
so those are some of them. And I think that what happens is that a lot of times, tribal people will go into into therapy, and like after the first or second session, they're done. They don't feel like the person really understands them or can connect with them, And so again, it's just a lack of knowledge, lack of awareness and skills, being able to work with tribal people. And then the
Yeah.
last thing that I can think of is just the role of elders and healers,
Mhm.
traditional healers, and that, uh, again, you don't know what you don't know in this
Mhm.
situation, and a lot of people don't understand the really powerful role that our elders and our healers have within our own tribes and within our communities in our own healing, and we just don't um, like the elders, there's so few of them, you know,
Mhm.
and medicine people, there's so few of them. And it's so hard because there's such a huge need. So
Mhm.
when I talk about working with elders, I'm like, we have to be really respectful of their time because
Mhm.
they're being asked by everybody, you know,
Mhm.
to help, you know, with funerals or, you know, just different things going on and healing, you know, just healing, you know, people and stuff. So I think that just not really understanding the importance and the role of elders and healers. And so
Mhm.
my best advice to non-native clinicians, you know, in working with tribal people is don't be afraid to ask, you know,
Mhm.
but ask the right people. You know, go to those people that are identified in those tribal communities and ask them. Don't make anything up, you
Mhm.
know, because these are grounded in thousands of years, you know, of cultural history, you know, that we, you know, so ask, you know, so that and get the right information, you know,
Mhm.
and support, you know, type of a thing. So those are a lot of the different, you know, barriers,
Mhm.
challenges, maybe, you know, that tribes really struggle with.
Yes. My next question is, how is access to mental health care treatment different for Indigenous communities compared to others?
Oh my gosh. One, so like I'm in Spokane, right? Spokane Valley. My
Mhm.
hometown on the reservation is like about an hour and a half north of here. But it is this little tribal community surrounded by mountains and a river. And it's like very remote, you know, out like
Mhm.
in the country, up in the mountains kind of area. And so we're so far away that it's really difficult to attract qualified, you know, good like
Mhm.
therapists, you know, or counselors, mental health professionals, or whatever, into our community, you know, um, to be able to provide the degree of help that we need.
Yes.
Because now if we think about children, you know, and if we look at trauma informed, you know, with the schools, you know, just in the community in general, you know, just the different, you know, things, activities that they get involved in.
Mhm.
Um, it's about getting qualified people into the tribal communities. Um, and that the other part of that is the level. I want to say that it's lack of resources also. So there's
Mhm.
not a lot of money in tribal programs to pay for a lot of the supports that we need. So you
Mhm.
have people that, you know, we can't attract them there. It's very difficult to get them there, especially with the level that we need. But then part of that is the lack of resources and being able to bring people there because you most likely would end up having to pay more, right? Pay them more than what they would end up being paid out here because they have to because we're so far away.
Mhm.
And then you know looking at just the lack of resources as far as and this will go this isn't just going to be just for people on the reservation, this is also out and spoke you know in more urban areas, is just the accessibility to culturally appropriate, but just to therapy in general. You know, and being able, I mean, to be able to afford it, you know, when you're out. And then there's a lot of people, like, so a lot of people that are on state funded medical insurance,
Mhm.
um, they don't get accepted by many people, right? Many of the therapists are out there. And so you have very few that you have a choice to
Mhm.
go see. So it's so a lot of it has to do with the systems kind of a thing, you know, that the system is set up in a way that it makes it really difficult, you know, for them
Mhm.
to be able to access those kinds of services. Um, Indian Health Service has what they call like encounter rates. There are
Mhm.
different um, funding that comes into Indian Health Services because of that that discrepancy, right? That disparity.
Mhm.
So that is to try to make up for it in a way that how can we bring in more, funding and resources through Indian Health Service so that we can, be able to get those. But still, a lot of the reservations that are just so remote, I mean, that's something you just can't change, right? Um,
Yeah.
but it can be more helpful, in more urban areas like where I'm at, if the funding, the financial resources, but also that they have access to qualified, good therapists,
Yeah.
and that's just not always the possibility.
Yeah.
It's always a struggle for sure.
Yes. My final question is, Mental Health America has said that Native and Indigenous people in the United States report going through extreme psychological distress 2.5 times more compared to the general population in a month. What are some of the risk factors for mental health conditions that Indigenous communities may face at higher rates compared to others?
Oh my gosh, a lot. I just think about like in 2014, the U.S. Department of Justice said that Native American children experience PTSD at the same rate as combat veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan.
Oh my gosh.
That's huge. So
Yes.
what it is, it's that collective intergenerational trauma on top of trauma, right? So it's just this kind of cumulative kind of trauma that we're experiencing all the time, and then it's misdiagnosed or undiagnosed because then
Mm-hmm.
people want to call it behavioral problems, or that's
Mm-hmm.
just him. So this idea that a person um, a person with trauma decontextualized looks like personality,
Mm-hmm.
right? Oh, it's just me. That's just how I am. Oh, that's just how she is. A family with trauma decontextualized looks like family culture.
Mm-hmm.
And community with trauma decontextualized looks like the community's, just all of this dysfunction, that's going on without even realizing, what is really happening. And so just having to like recognize that it's we have this historical stuff, that we're wired with, and then you add poverty, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you add, just what we were just talking about, just not, just no access, to good,
Yes.
support services, those types of things. And so it's like a cocktail mix of just traumatic stuff,
Yes.
that the government, hasn't been able to, to really, support us with, that the state hasn't,
Mm-hmm.
and then especially locally, because
Yes.
where we're located on tribes, we're typically surrounded by farms, farmers, those kinds of, and many of the communities that surround reservations are very racist. You'll
Mm-hmm.
find a lot of white supremacists, in these communities, that's kind of the community culture. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's really hard for us when we even need to go to the next town to go grocery shopping, or go to,
Yes.
you go do your business and you go home. You don't want to hang around out there, type of a thing. Um,
Yes.
the National Native Children's Trauma Center said that the average adverse childhood experience score for American Indians is approximately 50% higher than for individuals who identify as white.
Oh my
That's
gosh.
ACEs, right? The ACEs score, 50% higher. So you can see all, so just from what I've shared about just that kind of intergenerational stuff, that epigenetic, and then the ongoing kinds of trauma, the lack of resources, the lack of awareness and knowledge by people. So it's just this huge, um, it's so difficult to just kind of like really sort through it all because it's all of it, you
Mm-hmm.
know. That's why it's so hard for us. It's just so hard to kind of, once you figure things out, then you got to deal with a system that is so ingrained in the way that it does things. I just think about like the education system. It's like I've been working that system for over 20 years and I still haven't seen any changes in the education of my, what I did it at during the time when my children were in school, but now it's my grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a huge ship that can only move like 1 degree, right? It's so
Mm-hmm.
slow. And that, but it keeps that, the system keeps those, those biases and those prejudices, and all of that ingrained,
Mhm.
and it's hard to sort it out because they don't do a very good job of looking at themselves, and they
Mhm.
don't do a very good job of listening, to people that are saying this is what this is the kind of impact that your system is having on me and my family and our
Mhm.
community, type of a thing. So it's it's so much. It's so much. And it's just it's enraging when I think about people that say, you know what, that was a long time ago, just get over it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's like incredibly ignorant.
It is. It is. It's like, okay, all right. And how are you going to help us out with this? You know,
Yeah.
the really cool thing is that I'm just really happy. My grandmother was a fluent speaker in our tribal language. My
Mhm.
mother, as a boarding school, did not get the language, right? She was not able to have that. So she wasn't able to pass it on to me. But
Mhm.
as a teenager, I was all about that. I just as a
Mhm.
teenager, I wanted to know as much as I wanted could learn about my culture, and then I would ask my grandma, and so
Mhm.
she would then teach me the language. And
Mhm.
so, and now it's like in my family, like my daughter's a proficient speaker in our language, and stuff.
Mhm.
And so this is the first time my daughter's generation, this is the first time that I've been able to hear the language spoke, even on Facebook. I'm just like,
Mhm.
oh my gosh, in our orthography, which is our like our alphabet. And during my generation really struggled with it,
Mhm.
and so it just makes my heart so happy to see our youth. And what it does is it builds and strengthens cultural identity, and it builds and
Mhm.
strengthens their spiritual identity. And now our culture is coming back. Now, my kids' generations are all bringing it back, and the elders are there and they're generously giving, because of course they love their culture and they want to share and they love seeing these young people,
Mhm.
doing this. And so this is going to, the more that we can do this, this is really going to help, and
Yes.
what my daughter and I do is we look at it from a neurobiological perspective.
Mhm.
Let's tell you neurobiologically what's going on with you when you're engaged in these cultural activities, because
Mhm.
ancestors, they knew what they were doing and
Yes.
they were brilliant. So that's the whole nother training that we do, is just how, kind of looking at this, how the resilience, that comes through our culture, and
Mhm.
how that can be a part of our healing, is being able
Mhm.
to bring that back into our communities and helping our children and our families, with that. So there's
Yes.
hope, there's hope.
Yes.
We just need more help.
Yes. Well, that's all the questions that I have for tonight, but thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you having this discussion with me. I'll end the recording right now really quickly.